The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Justice Department as Attorney General Pam Bondi arrived earlier than usual. The security team nodded respectfully as she passed, her brisk pace reflecting the urgency she felt. Something about today felt different, tense like the air before a storm. "Morning, ma'am," said her assistant, handing her a steaming cup of coffee as she entered her office. "The reports you requested are on your desk." "Thanks, Tom," Bondi replied, setting her bag down and taking the coffee. She'd been working at the Justice Department for over 6 months now, but some days she still couldn't believe she held the position of Attorney General. Her journey from Florida's top prosecutor to the nation's had been a whirlwind, especially after Trump's surprising victory in the 2024 election. Bondi settled behind her desk, the polished wood surface cluttered with files despite her assistant's best efforts to keep things organized. The pile of intelligence reports caught her eye immediately, marked urgent in bold red letters. She took a sip of coffee and opened the first folder. As she read, her expression hardened. The intelligence was clear. Several Democratic lawmakers were planning to stage a coordinated protest during President Trump's upcoming address on law enforcement initiatives. According to the report, they intended to stand and turn their backs when the president discussed his plans for expanding federal law enforcement presence in major cities, a controversial policy that had already sparked heated debates across the country. Bondi leaned back in her chair, thinking, such a protest wouldn't just embarrass the president, it would undermine his authority on national television. And worse, it might encourage others to defy the administration's policies. She couldn't let that happen. Not on her watch. She pressed the intercom. "Tom, get me Director Patel on the line, please, and clear my schedule for the next hour." While waiting for the call, Bondi walked to the window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. Traffic moved steadily below, people going about their daily lives, unaware of the political tensions brewing behind closed doors in Washington. She thought about her last cabinet meeting just 2 days ago, when the president had praised her efforts to reshape the Justice Department. "Pam has been doing an incredible job," Trump had said, gesturing toward her with that familiar wave of his hand. "The best job. We're finally cleaning house and making real progress." She'd simply nodded and replied, "Thank you, President," in that way that had become her signature, dropping the Mr. or Trump that others used. Some people found it odd, even creepy, as one news outlet had put it, but it felt right to her, a sign of respect for the office and the man she believed was restoring proper order to the country. The intercom buzzed. "Director Patel on line 1, ma'am." Bondi picked up the phone. "Cash, good morning. Have you seen the intelligence about the planned disruption?" "Just reviewing it now," Patel's voice crackled through the speaker. "Seems credible. My sources say Warren and Nadler are leading it." "That doesn't surprise me," Bondi said, returning to her desk and sitting down. "They've been after us since day one. Just last week they sent that ridiculous letter accusing us of gutting public corruption offices. Which is rich considering what the previous administration did," Patel replied. "Exactly." Bondi tapped her fingers on the desk. "We need to address this head-on. I'm thinking of sending them a formal warning. Something they can't ignore or dismiss as partisan chatter." "A letter?" Patel sounded surprised. "That's pretty unusual, Pam." "These are unusual times, Cash." She pulled a legal pad toward her and began jotting notes. "The president's address is critical. It's going to set the tone for our national law enforcement strategy for the next year. We can't have it undermined by political theater." After ending the call with Patel, Bondi summoned her chief of staff, David, and her top legal advisor, Lisa. They arrived quickly, both looking curious about the urgent meeting. "Close the door," Bondi instructed as they entered. "We have a situation." She briefed them on the intelligence and her plan to send a formal warning to the Democratic lawmakers. David looked concerned, while Lisa took notes, her brow furrowed. "In concentration, ma'am," David began cautiously. Sending such a note could be seen as intimidation. The optics might not be good. "I'm not concerned about optics," Bondi replied firmly. I'm concerned about protecting the president's ability to communicate his policies to the American people without childish disruptions. Lisa looked up from her notepad. What exactly would this note say? Bondi leaned forward. It needs to be clear that we know about their plans. It needs to remind them that disrupting an official presidential address could have consequences, and it needs to make them think twice before going through with it. And if they see it as a threat? David asked. It's not a threat, Bondi said sharply. It's a reminder of their responsibilities as elected officials. There's a difference. For the next hour, the three of them drafted the note, carefully weighing each word. Bondi wanted it to be firm but not overtly threatening, a delicate balance. By the time they finished, the morning had given way to afternoon, and the note read, To the honorable members of Congress, it has come to the attention of the Department of Justice that certain members are planning coordinated disruptions during the President's upcoming address on national security and law enforcement initiatives. While the right to peaceful protest is fundamental to our democracy, deliberate disruption of an official presidential address may potentially constitute interference with government proceedings under certain circumstances. As Attorney General, I respectfully urge all members to consider the gravity of their constitutional duties and the example they set for the nation. The Justice Department remains committed to upholding both the rule of law and the dignity of our democratic institutions. Respectfully, Pamela J. Bondi, Attorney General of the United States. Bondi read it over one final time before nodding her approval. This will do. Have it delivered to Warren, Nadler, and the others first thing tomorrow morning. Yes, ma'am, David said, though he still looked uneasy. After they left, Bondi sat alone in her office, wondering if she was making the right move. She thought back to her confirmation hearings, when Senator Whitehouse had pressed her about whether she would target people simply because of their political affiliation. She had firmly denied that she would ever do such a thing. This isn't about politics, she murmured to herself. It's about respect for the office. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the White House Chief of Staff. POTUS wants to know if you're coming to the prep meeting for the address. 4 p.m. She quickly replied that she would be there, then gathered the intelligence reports into a folder. She'd show them to the president. He needed to know what they were up against. She also made a mental note to mention her note to the Democrats, though she wasn't sure how he'd react. Sometimes he appreciated her taking initiative. Other times he preferred to be consulted first. As she prepared to leave for another meeting, her phone rang again. It was an unknown number, which usually meant trouble. Attorney General Bondi, she answered crisply. Ma'am, this is Alexis from the Washington Post. We've heard rumors that you're taking unusual steps to prevent protests during the president's upcoming address. Would you care to comment? Bondi's grip on the phone tightened. How had they already caught wind of this? The note hadn't even been sent yet. The Department of Justice doesn't comment on rumors, she replied evenly. If you have specific questions about departmental policies, you can direct them to our press office. But, the reporter began. Good day, Bondi said firmly, ending the call. She stared at the phone for a moment, then set it down. The leak was concerning, but not entirely surprising. Washington ran on whispers and rumors. She'd need to be careful about how she presented this to the president now that the press was sniffing around. Outside her window, dark clouds had gathered, mirroring her mood. A storm was definitely coming, both literally and figuratively. But Bondi had never been one to shy away from storms. In fact, sometimes she felt most alive when facing into the wind. She gathered her things, straightened her jacket, and headed for the door. There was much to do before tomorrow, and Pam Bondi was nothing if not prepared. As she left her office, she couldn't help but wonder how the Democrats would respond to her note. Would they back down, or would they push back harder? Either way, she was ready for the fight. After all, that's what President Trump had chosen her for. Her willingness to stand firm in the face of opposition. And stand firm she would, no matter what came next. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly over Washington, D.C. By 7 a.m., 3 Justice Department couriers in dark suits had already been briefed on their unusual assignment. Each carried a slim, leather portfolio containing identical sealed envelopes. "Remember," said the deputy chief of staff who had handed them their packages, "these are to be delivered personally. Not to assistants, not to chiefs of staff. Directly to the members of Congress themselves." The couriers nodded solemnly. They understood the gravity of their task, even if they didn't know the exact contents of the envelopes they carried. Meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren was already at her desk, reviewing notes for an upcoming committee hearing. Her office was quiet this early, with only a few staffers typing away in the outer room. The gentle patter of rain against the window provided a soothing backdrop to her work. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. "Yes?" she called, looking up from her papers. Her assistant poked his head in. "Senator, there's a Justice Department courier here. He says he needs to deliver something to you personally." Warren frowned. "At this hour? That's odd." The courier, a young man with close-cropped hair and an expressionless face, stepped into the office. "Senator Warren," he said formally, "I have a delivery from Attorney General Bondi." He handed her the sealed envelope and remained standing there, apparently waiting for something. "Is there anything else?" Warren asked, turning the envelope over in her hands. "I've been instructed to wait for confirmation that you've received and read the contents, ma'am." Warren raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. As she read Bondi's message, her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief, and then to anger. "You can tell Attorney General Bondi that I have received and read her note," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "And you can tell her that I find it deeply concerning that the Department of Justice is now in the business of attempting to intimidate members of Congress. That will be all." The courier gave a slight nod, turned, and left without another word. Across town, a similar scene was playing out in Representative Jerry Nadler's office. The veteran congressman had just arrived and was shaking rain from his umbrella when the Justice Department courier approached him in the hallway. "Representative Nadler, sir. A delivery from Attorney General Bondi." Nadler took the envelope with a puzzled expression and opened it right there in the hallway. As he read, his bushy eyebrows drew together. "Well," he muttered, "this is a first." He looked up at the courier. "Please inform the Attorney General that I have received her message." The courier nodded and departed, leaving Nadler standing there, still holding the note and his dripping umbrella. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Elizabeth, it's Jerry. Did you just get a very strange note from our friend at Justice?" 20 minutes later, the news was spreading through Democratic offices across Capitol Hill. By 9 a.m., nearly a dozen lawmakers had received Bondi's warning, and the reaction was swift and unified. They were outraged. In a small conference room in the Capitol, Warren, Nadler, and 4 other senior Democrats gathered for an emergency meeting. The mood was tense as they passed Bondi's note around the table. "This is unprecedented," said Congressman Lee, a normally soft-spoken representative from California. "The Attorney General is essentially threatening members of Congress for exercising their First Amendment rights." "It's worse than that," Warren replied, tapping her finger on the table for emphasis. "She's using the Justice Department as a political weapon to protect Trump from criticism. This is exactly what we warned about during her confirmation hearings." Nadler nodded grimly, and exactly what she promised she wouldn't do. An aide knocked and entered the room. "Sorry to interrupt, but you all need to see this." He turned on the wall-mounted television, which was already tuned to Fox News. On screen, Pam Bondi sat across from a morning show host, looking composed in a navy blue suit. "Attorney General," the host was saying, "we're hearing reports that you've sent some kind of warning to Democratic lawmakers ahead of the president's address tomorrow. Can you tell us what that's about?" Bondi nodded. "Well, John, it's quite simple. We received credible intelligence that certain members of Congress were planning to disrupt the president's important address on law enforcement initiatives. As Attorney General, I felt it was my duty to remind these members of their responsibilities and the potential consequences of such actions." "And what would those consequences be?" the host asked. "I'm not going to speculate on specific legal actions, Bondi replied smoothly. But I will say this. The American people deserve to hear from their president without childish interruptions and political theatrics. The Justice Department is committed to ensuring that happens. Warren grabbed the remote and muted the TV. She's getting ahead of the story, trying to frame this as reasonable before the public sees how threatening it actually is. We need to respond, said Congresswoman Chen, the youngest of the group, and fast. If we let her control the narrative, we'll be playing defense all day. Nadler agreed. Let's draft our own letter. Make it clear that this isn't about disrupting the president's speech. It's about standing up for what's right. And we need to get this to the press immediately. As the Democrats huddled over their response, Bondi's note was already making its way through Washington's rumor mill. In newsrooms across the city, reporters were working the phones, trying to get their hands on a copy of the actual text. Noon, the story had exploded. CNN's Chiron read, AG Bondi warns Democrats against protesting Trump speech, while MSNBC went with, Justice Dept threatens lawmakers in unprecedented move. Meanwhile, Fox News took a different angle. Bondi takes strong stand against planned disruption of presidential address. At the White House, President Trump was reportedly delighted with the development. According to one aide who spoke anonymously, to the Washington Post, the president called Bondi personally to congratulate her on her tough approach. He loves this kind of thing, the aide was quoted as saying. Anything that makes the Democrats look like they're on defense, he's all for it. By early afternoon, Warren and Nadler had finalized their response. Their letter, signed by all 12 Democrats who had received Bondi's note, was hand-delivered to the Attorney General's office and simultaneously released to the press. It read, in part, Your unprecedented attempt to intimidate members of Congress is not only inappropriate, but raises serious constitutional concerns about the separation of powers. Members of Congress have not only the right, but the duty to express disagreement with administration policies. Any suggestion that such expression could lead to legal consequences represents a dangerous overreach by the Department of Justice. The letter went on to connect Bondi's note to broader concerns about the politicization of the Justice Department under her leadership, specifically citing the dismantling of the Public Integrity Section and the removal of career prosecutors who had worked on cases involving Trump. As copies of both Bondi's original note and the Democrats' response circulated online, public reaction split predictably along partisan lines. Conservative commentators praised Bondi for taking a stand against what they characterized as disrespectful behavior toward the president, while liberal voices warned of creeping authoritarianism. Outside the Justice Department building, a small group of protesters gathered in the rain, holding signs with slogans like Hands Off Congress and Bondi Trump's Enforcer. The crowd was modest, perhaps 50 people at its peak, but news cameras were there to capture the scene, ensuring it would be featured in the evening broadcasts. Inside her office, Bondi watched the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and irritation. The leak of her note had come sooner than expected, forcing her to go public before all the deliveries were complete. But overall, she felt the operation had gone according to plan. The Democrats were rattled, and the president was pleased. Her phone rang. The White House again. Pam, it's Doug, said the president's chief of staff. He wants you at the prep session for tomorrow's speech. Can you be here in 30? Of course, she replied. I'm on my way. As she gathered her things, Bondi glanced at a text message that had just arrived from her mother back in Florida. Saw you on TV, honey. Be careful. These are dangerous waters you're swimming in. Bondi smiled slightly as she texted back. Don't worry, Mom. I know what I'm doing. But as she rode in her government SUV toward the White House, lights flashing to cut through the afternoon traffic, even Pam Bondi had to admit to herself that she wasn't entirely sure where this would lead. She had escalated the already tense relationship between the administration and congressional Democrats to a new level. There would be consequences, political at least, if not legal. Still, she felt a certain thrill at being at the center of the storm. This was why she had taken this job, to fight for what she believed in, to stand up for the president she admired. If that meant making enemies, so be it. The rain was letting up as her car pulled through the White House gates. Ahead, the historic building gleamed wet and white against the gray sky. Inside, the president was waiting, ready to rehearse the speech that had now become the focus of a national controversy, before he had even delivered it. Bondi straightened her jacket, checked her reflection in the car window, and strode toward Day. The entrance, ready for whatever came next. The note had been delivered, the battle lines were drawn. Now it was Tim, to prepare for tomorrow's main event, and the storm that would surely follow. Senator Elizabeth Warren's office had transformed into a war room. Staffers rushed back and forth, phones rang constantly, and the conference room was packed with Democratic lawmakers and their top aides. Coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches littered the table as the clock ticked past 8 p.m. Despite the late hour, no one showed any sign of leaving. "We need something stronger than just a letter," said Congressman Rivera, pacing by the window. "Bondi has crossed a line and we can't let it stand." Warren nodded, rubbing her temples. The day had been a whirlwind since receiving Bondi's note that morning. News outlets had been calling nonstop. Social media was ablaze with heated arguments. And her office had received hundreds of messages from constituents, some supportive, others accusatory. "The problem is," said Warren, "Bondi is framing this as simply reminding us of our responsibilities. She's playing the reasonable one while painting us as troublemakers planning to disrupt a presidential address." "Which wasn't even our plan," added Congressman Lee. "We were going to stand silently when he talked about deploying federal agents to cities without local approval. A silent protest, not heckling or interrupting." Nadler, who had been quietly listening from the corner of the room, finally spoke up. "We need to reframe this entire conversation. This isn't about protest tactics. It's about the Justice Department being weaponized against political opponents. Exactly what Bondi promised she wouldn't do during her confirmation." The room fell silent as everyone considered his words. "Jerry's right," Warren said finally. "This is bigger than tomorrow's speech. This is about the rule of law and the separation of powers." A young aide knocked on the door frame. "Senator Warren, Congressman Nadler, CNN is ready for you in 5 minutes." The two senior lawmakers exchanged glances. They had agreed to do a joint interview, knowing it would reach millions of viewers and help shape public understanding of the situation. "Remember," Warren said to Nadler as they walked toward the makeshift television setup in her office's main room, "we stay focused on the constitutional issues. This isn't personal." Nadler nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The note from Bondi had felt very personal indeed. As the camera crew made final adjustments, Warren's chief of staff handed her a tablet displaying the latest headlines. The story had completely taken over the news cycle. Every major outlet was covering it, and political commentators were debating the implications of Bondi's actions with increasing intensity. "We're live in 30 seconds, said the producer. Warren set the tablet aside and straightened in her chair. Next to her, Nadler adjusted his tie one last time. "And we're live in 3, 2, 1. The anchor's face appeared on the monitor. "Good evening. We're joined now by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Jerry Nadler, who earlier today received what many are calling an unprecedented warning from Attorney General Pam Bondi regarding tomorrow's presidential address. Thank you both for being with us." "Thank you for having us," Warren replied. "Senator Warren, let me start with you. What exactly did the Attorney General's note say, and what was your reaction when you received it?" Warren's response was measured, but firm. The Attorney General's note suggested that members of Congress exercising their First Amendment rights during the president's address could face legal consequences. My reaction was one of deep concern, not just for myself, but for what this represents. When the Department of Justice begins threatening elected representatives for their political expression, we've entered dangerous territory. The interview continued for 15 minutes with both lawmakers carefully explaining their concerns while avoiding inflammatory language. They emphasized that their planned protest had always been intended to be dignified and silent, not disruptive as Bondi had characterized it. As the interview concluded, Nadler made a final point that would be widely quoted in the coming days. The Attorney General swore an oath to the Constitution, not to the President. Her job is to uphold the law, not to shield the president from peaceful political expression. Back at the Justice Department, Bondi watched the interview from her office where she was working late despite having just returned from the White House speech preparation session. She scribbled notes as Warren and Nadler spoke, occasionally, shaking her head in disagreement. When her phone rang, she answered without checking the caller ID, assuming it was one of her staff. "Bondi here. You've really stirred them up, haven't you?" The president's voice was unmistakable, slightly raspy with that distinctive New York accent. "President," she replied, straightening reflexively even though no one could see her. "I was just watching Warren and Nadler on CNN. They're going crazy," Trump said, sounding pleased. "Absolutely crazy. But you know what? People are talking about how they were planning to disrupt my speech. That's the story now. You did good? Really good. Thank you, sir. I think it was important to send a clear message. Very clear. Very strong. I like it when my people stand up to these Democrats. Too many Republicans are afraid of them, you know? Not you, though. You're a fighter." The conversation continued for a few minutes, with Trump offering suggestions for how Bondi should handle press questions tomorrow. As usual, he was deeply engaged with the media strategy, seeing it as a key battleground. After the call ended, Bondi sat back in her chair, feeling a mix of pride and unease. The president's approval meant a lot to her, but she also understood the risks of what she had set in motion. The Democrats were rallying, the press was in a feeding frenzy, and constitutional scholars were already raising alarms about the implications of her note. Her deputy, Richard, knocked on her open door. "Got a minute?" "Come in," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Richard closed the door behind him. He had been with Bondi since her days as Florida's Attorney General, and was one of the few people who would speak candidly to her. "I've been getting calls from career staff all day," he said, his expression troubled. "They're concerned about how this is playing out. Some are worried we've crossed a line." Bondi frowned. "The career staff need to understand that we have a job to do. The president's policies deserve a fair hearing without childish stunts from lawmakers who should know better." "I get that," Richard replied carefully. "But there's also the matter of how this looks. Using the Justice Department to warn political opponents, it feeds into the narrative that we're politicizing the department. It's not political to uphold decorum in official proceedings. You know it's more complicated than that, Pam." By morning, the story had grown even bigger. People across America woke up to news alerts on their phones and headlines splashed across television screens. Outside the Justice Department, a crowd of protesters had gathered despite the early hour, their numbers steadily growing as the workday began. They carried handmade signs with slogans like "Defend Democracy" and "Justice, Not Politics." Inside her apartment, Pam Bondi sipped her coffee and flipped through news channels, watching how different networks were covering the controversy. Fox News praised her bold stand against Democrat disruption, while MSNBC ran with "Attorney General's threat to Congress raises constitutional alarms." CNN tried for a more neutral approach. Tensions rise between DOJ and Democrats ahead of presidential address. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she'd woken up. The White House wanted to coordinate messaging. Republican lawmakers were calling to offer support, and her press team was frantically trying to prepare her for the media gauntlet she would face when she left for work. Bondi set down her coffee cup and walked to her closet, considering her options carefully. Today wasn't just another day at the office, it was a battle for public opinion. She chose a crisp navy suit that conveyed authority without seeming intimidating. The pearls her father had given her when she graduated law school completed the look. They always made her feel more confident. As her car approached the Justice Department, she could see the protesters and the news vans lining the street. Camera flashes sparked like lightning as she emerged from the vehicle. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into an incomprehensible roar. "Attorney General Bondi, do you stand by your warning to Democratic lawmakers? Is this an attempt to silence criticism of the president? Are you concerned about the constitutional implications of your actions?" Bondi had planned to walk straight inside without comment, but something made her pause. She turned to face the press corps, and the shouting quickly died down as reporters realized she was about to speak. The Department of Justice respects the constitutional rights of all Americans, including members of Congress, she said, her voice steady. But respect for our democratic institutions must go both ways. My note was simply a reminder of that fact. Thank you. With that brief statement, she turned and walked inside, leaving the reporters clamoring for more. Her press secretary, who had been watching nervously, hurried after her. That wasn't the plan, he said, trying to keep pace with her brisk stride. Plans change, Bondi replied. Better to give them something than nothing. How bad is it inside? The phone lines are jammed. Every news outlet in the country wants a statement or an interview, and... He hesitated. And what? The Democrats filed their complaint with the Inspector General an hour ago. It's already leaked to the press, Bondi nodded, unsurprised. What about the White House? What's their position? Full support. The president called you tough as nails in a tweet this morning. That brought a small smile to her face. Whatever else happened today, she still had the president's backing. That counted for a lot in this town. As Bondi disappeared into her office for a series of urgent meetings, the story continued to unfold across Washington. At the Capitol, Democratic lawmakers were holding their own press conference, wearing the pins they had decided on the night before, small scales of justice symbolizing their concern about the rule of law. Senator Warren stood at the microphone, flanked by Nadler and several other members who had received Bondi's note. This morning we filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice Inspector General, Warren announced. Attorney General Bondi's attempt to intimidate members of Congress crosses a dangerous line. It represents exactly the kind of politicization of the Justice Department that she promised wouldn't happen under her leadership. A reporter raised his hand. Senator Warren, what exactly were you and your colleagues planning to do during the president's speech tonight? We were planning a dignified, silent protest during portions of the speech dealing with the deployment of federal agents to American cities against the wishes of local officials, standing silently. That's it. Warren's tone was firm. The suggestion that this constituted some kind of disruption warranting a formal warning from the Attorney General is frankly absurd. Nadler stepped forward. I'd like to add that this isn't just about a note. It's about a pattern of behavior. Since taking office, Attorney General Bondi has dismantled the public integrity section that investigates corruption. She's fired career prosecutors who worked on cases involving the president. And now she's using the power of her office to try to silence political opposition. This is not what the Department of Justice is for. Across town at the White House, President Trump was meeting with his senior staff to discuss the evening's address. The controversy over Bondi's note had created a new dynamic, and his advisors were split on how to handle it. The speech needs to acknowledge what's happening, said his communications director. We can't just ignore the elephant in the room. Trump nodded, leaning back in his chair. Pam did good. She showed strength. The Democrats are always trying to make me look bad, and finally someone stood up to them. Yes, sir, his chief of staff replied cautiously. But there's a risk of escalating this further. The media is already framing it as an attack on congressional independence. Trump waved dismissively. The media always takes their side. What matters is our base loves it. They're tired of these Democrats and their stunts. What about adding a line to the speech? Suggested another advisor. Something about respecting the office of the president regardless of political differences. Trump considered this, then nodded. I like that. Make it strong. And let's call Pam, have her come to the speech tonight. Front row. I want her visible. As the day progressed, the controversy showed no signs of fading. Political analysts debated the implications on every news channel. Constitutional scholars issued statements expressing concern about the separation of powers. Social media was ablaze with hashtags both supporting and condemning Bondi's actions. By late afternoon, new polling showed the nation split almost exactly. Down the middle on the issue, 47% thought Bondi had overstepped, while 46% supported her, with the remainder undecided. Like so many political controversies in recent years, people's opinions largely followed their existing party affiliations. At 4:30 p.m., Bondi received an unexpected visitor in her office, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, and you, independent watchdog responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct. This is highly unusual, the Inspector General said, taking a seat across from Bondi. I've never had a complaint filed against an Attorney General by multiple members of Congress before. Bondi kept her expression neutral. These are unusual times. Indeed. The Inspector General placed a folder on the desk between them. I wanted to inform you personally that I'm opening a formal investigation into the matter. Given the high-profile nature of the complaint and the constitutional questions involved, I felt it was appropriate. Bondi nodded slowly. She had expected this, but the reality of it still stung. I understand, and I want you to know that I stand firmly behind my actions. The note was not a threat. It was a reminder of proper decorum during an official presidential address. That will be for the investigation to determine, the Inspector General replied evenly. I'll need all communications related to the drafting and delivery of the note, as well as any conversations you had with the White House about it. After the Inspector General left, Bondi sat alone in her office, the weight of the situation finally hitting her full force. She had known her note would cause a stir, but she hadn't anticipated quite this level of blowback. An Inspector General, investigation was serious, potentially career-threatening. Her phone buzzed with a text from the White House. POTUS wants you at speech tonight. Front row. Car will pick you up at 7. At least the president still had her back. But as Bondi gathered her things to head home and change for the evening's event, she couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Had she miscalculated? Had her loyalty to Trump led her to cross a line she shouldn't have? She pushed the doubts aside. It was too late for second-guessing now. The note was sent, the battle lines were drawn, and in a few hours she would be sitting front and center as the president delivered his address, with the very lawmakers she had warned watching from across the aisle. As evening fell over Washington, both sides prepared for what promised to be a tense night. Security around the Capitol had been dramatically increased, with police officers stationed at every entrance and snipers visible on the rooftops. Inside, staff hurried to complete final preparations for the president's arrival. In a holding room near the House chamber, Democratic lawmakers gathered to put on their scales of justice pins and review their strategy one last time. The mood was solemn but determined. Remember, Warren told the group, we show our protest through these pins and our dignified silence. Nothing that can be twisted into proving Bondi right. Meanwhile, in her Georgetown townhouse, Bondi changed into a formal black dress for the evening. As she fastened her pearl necklace, her phone rang. Her mother calling from Florida. I'm worried. About you, Pammy, her mother said without preamble. This is getting nasty. I'm fine, Mom, Bondi replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. It's just Washington politics. Your father always said politics was like a knife fight in a phone booth. No room to maneuver and someone always gets cut. Bondi smiled despite herself. Her father had a way with words. I'll be careful. I promise. As she hung up, Bondi took one last look in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her looked poised and professional. Every inch the Attorney General. But beneath that polished exterior, questions and doubts swirled like storm clouds. Tonight would be a test, not just for the president and the Democratic opposition, but for Pam Bondi herself. She sighed. The Capitol glowed against the night sky, its dome illuminated like a beacon. Inside, the atmosphere was electric as lawmakers, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, and other dignitaries filed into the House chamber for the president's address. News cameras captured every arrival, commentators noting who spoke to whom, who avoided each other, who seemed tense or relaxed. Pam Bondi's entrance caused a noticeable stir. Heads turned as she walked down the center aisle in her black dress, and pearls, escorted by a senior Republican congressman. Several Democratic lawmakers pointedly looked away as she passed. Others stared directly at her, their small scales of justice pins gleaming under the bright lights. Attorney General Bondi, arriving now, the CNN anchor narrated, As you can see, she's being seated in the front row, a clear show of support from the administration despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy surrounding her warning to Democratic lawmakers. Bondi took her seat, her face a careful mask of composure. She nodded to Secretary of State Rubio beside her and exchanged a few quiet words with the Treasury Secretary. If she noticed the cold looks from across the aisle, she gave no sign of it. On the Democratic side of the chamber, Senator Warren sat with Congressman Nadler and the others who had received Bondi's note. All wore their scales of justice pins, prominently. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the Attorney General. "She looks pretty confident for someone under investigation by her own Inspector General," Nadler muttered. "Of course she does," Warren replied. "She has Trump's backing. That's all that matters to her." The chamber gradually filled, the background, noise growing as hundreds of conversations blended together. Security personnel stood at attention along the walls, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Tonight's address had been designated a high-security event, with extra precautions in place due to the heightened tensions. At 8:57 p.m., the House Sergeant-at-Arms entered the chamber. "Mr. Speaker," he announced in a booming voice, "the President of the United States." The room erupted in applause as President Trump entered, waving and smiling to the crowd. Republicans jumped to their feet with enthusiastic clapping, while Democrats offered more restrained applause, some rising only partially from their seats. Trump made his way to the podium, shaking hands with lawmakers along the aisle. When he reached the front, he turned and handed copies of his speech to the Vice President and the Speaker of the House, as tradition dictated. Then he faced the chamber, waiting for the applause to die down. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice filling the room. "Tonight, I stand before you at a time of great prosperity and strength for our nation, but also at a time of great challenge." The first 20 minutes of the speech focused on economic achievements and foreign policy successes. Trump was in his element, pausing for applause lines, deviating occasionally from the teleprompter to add his own remarks. The chamber responded predictably. Republicans applauded enthusiastically, Democrats less so, though they did join in for certain nonpartisan moments. Bondi watched with obvious approval from her front row seat, clapping vigorously at each achievement. The president listed. Warren and her colleagues remained mostly expressionless, applauding only sparingly. Then, the speech shifted to domestic law enforcement, the topic that had sparked the entire controversy. "We cannot allow lawlessness to prevail in American cities," Trump declared, his tone hardening. "When local officials fail to protect their citizens, the federal government must step in. That is why I am announcing tonight an expansion of our law enforcement initiatives in cities where crime has spiraled out of control." As he detailed the plan to deploy federal agents to more cities without waiting for local approval, the Democratic lawmakers with the scales of justice pins remained seated while Republicans rose for a standing ovation. They didn't turn their backs or shout. They simply sat in dignified silence, their pins visible. Trump paused, seeming to notice the silent protest. He glanced briefly at Bondi, then continued with a line that hadn't been in the prepared remarks. "Some may disagree with these policies," he said, looking directly at the seated Democrats. "That is their right in our democracy. But the office of the president deserves respect, regardless of political differences. The American people deserve better than political theatrics during important addresses about our nation's future." The Republican side of the chamber erupted in applause again. Bondi nodded in approval, a slight smile on her face. The Democrats remained stone-faced, though Warren's jaw tightened visibly. As the speech continued, touching on immigration, healthcare, and infrastructure, the tension in the room seemed to ease slightly. By the time Trump reached his conclusion, the theatrical moment had passed without major incident. "God bless you, God bless our troops, and God bless the United States of America," the president finished, to thunderous applause from the Republican side. As lawmakers began to file out of the chamber, reporters rushed to get reactions. Bondi, was quickly surrounded by a group of Republican congressmen who formed a protective circle around her, shielding her from the press as they escorted her toward the exit. Warren, Nadler, and their colleagues moved together toward a prearranged location where they planned to give a joint statement to the media. Their peaceful protest, simply sitting in silence with their pins, had made their point without giving Bondi or Trump ammunition to claim they had disrupted the speech. In a small room off the main corridor, the Democratic lawmakers gathered before facing the press. "Well, that went according to plan," Nadler said, loosening his tie. "No disruption they can point to." "Did you catch Trump's added line about political theatrics?" asked Congresswoman Chen. "That was clearly aimed at us." Warren nodded. "Of course it was, but they can't claim we did anything inappropriate. We just sat there. That's our right." A staff member poked her head into the room. "Senators, representatives, the press is ready whenever you are." They walked out to face a wall of cameras and microphones. Warren stepped forward to speak first. "Tonight, we witnessed the president announce a policy of federal intervention in American cities against the wishes of local elected officials. We registered our protest peacefully and respectfully by remaining seated and wearing these pins symbolizing our commitment to the rule of law. Despite Attorney General Bondi's warning note suggesting we might face consequences for expressing our views, we exercised our constitutional rights as members of Congress to disagree with the president's policies." Nadler spoke next. "The president's remarks about political theatrics were ironic, given that the only real theatrics in this situation came from the Attorney General sending threatening notes to members of Congress. We will continue to pursue our complaint with the Inspector General because this kind of intimidation has no place in our democracy." Meanwhile, on the other side of the Capitol, Bondi was giving her own statement to friendly reporters. "I was pleased to see that the Democrats chose to express their disagreement in an appropriate manner tonight," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "That's all my note was ever meant to encourage, respectful behavior during an official presidential address. The American people deserve to hear the president's important message without disruption, and tonight they did." A reporter called out, "What about the Inspector General investigation, Attorney General?" Bondi's smile never faltered. "I welcome any review of my actions. I'm confident that a fair examination will show that I acted appropriately to protect the dignity of a presidential address." As both sides spun the evening's events to their advantage, the real impact was playing out on television screens across America. Split-screen images showed Bondi and Warren giving their competing statement. Cable news panels debated who had won the night's political chess match. Social media erupted with partisan takes on both sides. Back at the White House, President Trump held court in the Oval Office, surrounded by senior advisors. He was in a jubilant mood, pleased with his speech and the reaction it had received. "Did you see them just sitting there with their little pins?" he said, chuckling. "Pam really got to them. They were afraid to do anything after her note." His chief of staff was more measured. "They're still pursuing the Inspector General complaint, sir. This isn't over for the Attorney General." Trump waved dismissively. "She'll be fine. I've got her back, and she was right. They were planning something worse until she sent that note." Across town in her Georgetown townhouse, Bondi finally allowed herself to relax. She kicked off her heels, poured a glass of wine, and sank onto her couch. Her phone buzzed with a text from the president. "Perfect. You showed real strength." They backed down. She smiled at the message but didn't reply immediately. The evening had gone better than she'd expected. The Democrats' protest had been so restrained it was barely noticeable, which she could claim as a victory for her warning note. The president was pleased. The conservative media was portraying her as a tough defender of presidential dignity. But as she sipped her wine, Bondi couldn't shake the knowledge that this was just the beginning of a longer battle. The Inspector General investigation would continue. Congressional Democrats would likely call for hearings. Her tenure as Attorney General, which had already been controversial, would now be defined by this episode. Had it been worth it? She wasn't entirely sure. But in Washington's zero-sum political game, today counted as a win. Tomorrow's problems would have to wait for tomorrow. In Senator Warren's office, a different kind of debrief was taking place. The Democratic lawmakers who had worn the scales of justice pins gathered to assess the evening and plan their next steps. The peaceful protest worked, Warren said. We made our point without giving them ammunition. But Trump still got to announce his federal intervention plan, Congressman Lee pointed out. And now he'll claim our subdued response means we're not seriously opposed to it. That's why this can't end tonight, Warren replied firmly. The pin protest was just the beginning. Now we push forward with the Inspector General complaint. We call for hearings on Bondi's actions, and we challenge the federal intervention plan on its merits. Nadler nodded in agreement. We also need to keep connecting the dots for the public, showing how Bondi's note fits into the broader pattern of politicizing the Justice Department. As the meeting wrapped up, Warren found herself alone in her office staring out at the Washington night. The Capitol dome was still illuminated, a reminder of the democratic institutions that had endured for nearly 2.5 centuries. Those institutions were being tested now, perhaps more than at any time in recent memory. She thought of Bondi's note, still sitting in her desk drawer. Such a small thing to have caused such a big controversy. But sometimes, Warren reflected, the most important battles in a democracy weren't fought over grand policies or sweeping changes. Sometimes they were fought over small but crucial principles, like the right of elected representatives to express dissent without fear of consequences. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Inspector General investigation would proceed. Congressional hearings would be scheduled. The media would continue to dissect every aspect of the controversy, and the fundamental questions raised by Bondi's note would remain at the center of the national conversation. Where was the line between maintaining respect for democratic institutions and protecting the right to dissent? Who decided when that line had been crossed? And what happened to a democracy when the Justice Department itself became a political battleground? For tonight, though, both Bondi and Warren could claim a kind of victory. The Attorney General had seen a subdued protest that she could attribute to her warning. The senator had registered her opposition without giving her opponents grounds to claim disruption. In Washington's political chess game, the match had ended in a draw, for now. But as both women knew well, in politics the game never really ends. It just moves to a different board with different pieces, and tomorrow would bring a whole new match.